Now it's my distinct pleasure to get to welcome our first speaker of the conference, John Echohawk. He is the director of the Native American Rights Fund, has been there since its inception in 1970. He was the first graduate of the University of New Mexico Special Program to train Indian lawyers and has been recognized as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America by the National Law Journal. John has received more awards than I can possibly mention and serves on multiple boards, including, just to name a few, the American Indian Resources Institute, the Association of American Indian Affairs, the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, and our very own advisory council to the Getches-Wilkinson Center. So please help me welcome John Echohawk.
Thank you, Alice. I'm very honored to be asked to give the opening remarks for the conference this morning. It's a real honor for me. As Alice said, I'm on the advisory council of the Getches-Wilkinson Center, and me and David Getches and Charles Wilkinson go way back when we started the Native American Rights Fund in 1970. David Getches was our founding director, and I was one of the first lawyers hired by David. Charles was another one, and together we took off and started to provide legal representation to our tribes across the country on the most important issues. We were guided by an all Native American board of directors who helped us determine those priorities. And there were just a lot of unrepresented tribes, a lot of big Indian law issues out there at that time. It was just the end of the termination era, when the federal policy was breaking the treaties, assimilating, forced assimilation of tribes, Native people. But we decided we would stand up for our rights, our right to self-determination, our right to our sovereignty, and the Native American Rights Fund led the charge under David's leadership, with me and Charles and some other lawyers doing that cases. One of those issues we identified was helping the tribes protect their water rights. Most of these tribes are west of the Mississippi. Of course, as you know, it's an arid area. Water is very important. Without water, you have no future. And tribes have senior reserve water rights under a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1908. I learned at the UNM Law School studying federal Indian law, one of the first courses ever taught in Indian law. The Winters case in 1908 says when the reservations were established, Congress impliedly reserved sufficient water for them for their present and future uses, with the priority date at least as early as the time the reservation was started, if not since time immemorial. So we started filing these water rights cases for tribes because they wanted to make sure that they had a future. And we enlisted the assistance of the federal government, the Justice Department. Like I said, they'd been on the sidelines through this whole termination era, but they have a trust responsibility. Our lands and resources are held in trust for us by the federal government. Again, a key principle of federal Indian law and policy. And so they have a trust responsibility to help us. So we educated the government in Washington about that, and they started joining us in bringing these water rights cases in the West. And, basically kind of some of the largest cases in the West, because, of course, it required joinder of 81 claiming a right to water. And that's a lot of people out here. And as we proceeded forward, as you might guess, we got a lot of attention, particularly from the Western states and the Western Governors Association and Western Attorney Generals and the Western States Water Council. And what is this Winters Doctrine? What is this tribal reserve rights? What's going on here? Your rights are senior to our state rights. They called a big meeting down in Denver, the Western Governors and Western States Water Council and the tribes, and the tribes brought me in since I represented so many of them, and had to explain to the Western leaders, Western state leaders about all of this. They weren't really clear on it, and we talked about it. And this is going to take decades to resolve these cases, and what are we going to do? And litigation can always be settled. They said, okay, well, let's settle these cases. Let's start negotiating and settle. And okay, well, let's get the federal government involved because, of course, they have a trust responsibility. They're helping us. So we all went to Washington and talked to the Secretary of Interior and got the Secretary of Interior's Indian Water Rights Office started to head up all these negotiations on all these cases pending in the West. And away we went. Since that time, that was in the early 80s, we have together finished 34 congressionally approved water rights settlements. The Native American Rights Fund has been involved in 9 of those cases that got settled. And we're currently representing 6 tribes as that whole process continues. And there are now 20 sets of negotiations going on across the West on these issues. And there's other tribes lined up outside Interior wanting to get their negotiations started on their water rights claims, because of course there's lots of tribes in the West that have these water issues. Well, the situation changed dramatically here last year with the pandemic. A new water issue arose. It was especially prevalent there on the large Navajo reservation, our largest reservation, when it came to light that COVID was raging down there because most of the Navajo people didn't have access to clean water. Right now, just, no facilities, bad structure, polluted water, if they had any. It was just really a devastating situation. And of course, they weren't the only reservation that had those kinds of conditions out west. Basically, all of them did in some form or fashion. Just no access to clean water. Well, some of the leaders, and we'll be hearing about that at the next panel here, from Ann and them, they came together to create the Universal Access to Clean Water on Tribal Lands core group to pull all this information together and see what couldn't be done about it. And they did some fabulous work doing all this research, pulling all this information together about the problems on reservations because they didn't have access to clean water. Well, they reached out and asked me to participate in this core group on universal access to clean water for tribes because of my experience on the water rights settlement negotiations and things. These settlements, when they go through, we're usually able to sit down with our neighbors and figure out how to share this resource that we have together in a good way. And oftentimes, to make that happen, it's going to cost a lot of money, lots of infrastructure required to make that happen. And getting that money from the Congress is always the most difficult part of the settlements. In trying to convince the administrations to support those settlements, lots of meetings we had with the Office of Management and Budget, and they would look at this stuff, and of course they didn't know much about it, but they would study it and go, well, most of this money, a lot of it is going to build infrastructure. And there's all these programs we have in the government for access to clean water infrastructure. And how come you don't have that? Well, it's way underfunded, and the tribes just don't really get much of that at all. And about the only way they can get it is in these settlements. They finally have a chance. They got some leverage. They can get the infrastructure they need to utilize water in a good way. Well, that was the issue then that the Universal Access to Clean Water core group focused on, is what's the problem there? They brought the information forward. 48% of our households on reservations, no access to clean water. Just bad facilities, no facilities, polluted water, no operation and maintenance monies. It's just really prevalent. So they got to work. They put together as part of, the provisions in the infrastructure bill. It's pending in Congress now, together with the reconciliation bill pending in Congress. Billions of dollars to go to tribes to help address this universal access to clean water that they lack. And of course, we all know, we're following what's happening in Washington. Those bills are pending right now. And these tribal provisions are in there. They're really very important to us. And we're going to be, of course, talking about that here at the conference. I was asked to help with that whole process, and I did by bringing on the National Congress of American Indians. They're part of this ad hoc group on these Indian water rights settlements that we have. They're the national intertribal organization that has the most influence there on the Hill in Washington. And they supported us in a resolution that went forward, led by Senator Bennett here from Colorado, that basically supported this universal access to clean water funding for the tribes, and that money should proceed to be given to the tribes whether they have a water rights settlement or not. That settlements were not a requirement to be able to access these funds to get clean water. So all that's pending in these bills now, the infrastructure and reconciliation bills. We have, of course, a conference here dealing with equity in the Colorado River Basin, how to sustainably manage a shrinking resource, and that brings forward basically kind of another big issue that we're dealing with, beside the pandemic right now, and that's climate change. It's just really gotten worse and worse and worse. And as many of you know, that's really called for a drought contingency plan in the Colorado River Basin. And so the meeting started on that, and initially, no tribes at the table. Even though we had the senior reserve rights in the Colorado River Basin, 30 tribes. Well, they finally realized that and brought the tribes in, and the tribes led the way in finally negotiating that drought contingency plan, with the tribes sharing part of their reserve water rights to make everything happen. And of course, all that's still going on. It's getting worse and worse, so we're going to have to do some more negotiations, but at least tribes are at the table. That equity issue is really coming through here in terms of both universal access to clean water and the drought contingency plan, and we're going to be talking about those things here today. These conferences that the center puts on always features Native American issues. So many people don't know about them, so it's really good that we have these opportunities to do that. The efforts on universal clean water access, same thing, opportunity to educate everyone about Indian reservations and tribal rights, and we're able to do that here in the drought contingency planning efforts as well. And more people are finally starting to understand tribes and federal Indian law and policy. That's really a terrific development, because probably the biggest issue that I've dealt with over the 51 years I've been with the Native American Rights Fund, again, is so many people in the public do not know anything about these issues. And we're always doing what we can to educate them. Tribal leaders know. One of the things they have to do all the time is go around and do Indian Law and Policy 101 over and over and over and over. And of course, we're all working to try to get all this into our basic education institutions, and teaching about civics, government. We're part of the United States government. There's 3 sovereigns in this country. There's the federal government, there's the state governments, and there's the tribal governments. And so many people don't know that, they don't realize that. So we're going to be talking about all this today in the context of these issues in the Colorado River Basin. I'm really very pleased to be part of the Getches-Wilkinson Center and to be able to sponsor this conference, and look forward to all the conversations and the learning that's going to go on here, and hopefully we'll be able to help with some of the solutions to all of these issues that we face here in the Colorado River Basin. So thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Really fitting way to start us off, touching on all the topics we'll be talking about over the next 2 days, particularly this morning on, I just think about how we take it for granted. You know, you fill up your water bottle, you brush your teeth. There's people in America who don't get that. We all heard about Flint, Michigan, but this has been going on in tribal communities for decades. So I'm really excited about what we'll be talking about in the next couple of hours. And that allows me to introduce my friend Ann Cass.